So in light of that, I'd like to welcome our very first speaker, and his name is Joel. And Joel Paulson, just to give you a little background on Joel. Joel basically is a senior at Swarthmore College. He is a member of Athletes for Diversity. He's a community leader. He's a Philadelphia volunteer. Joel is basically also on the anti-racism task force in one of the big organizations that he is. And Joel is a leader, okay? And so this young man, and just to let you know, one of the things that we do, which is very different, is that this is a multi-generational discussion of Black men. And so Joel represents Generation Z. So I'd like Joel to basically start out. Now, what I'm going to probably do is let me have Joel start out. Then after that, we're going to watch a video. Then we'll discuss it after. But I want Joel to basically start out. Joel, can you unmute?
Yes, I can. Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. Just a quick correction on what Mr. Law said. I'm a junior at Swarthmore. I'm double majoring in political science and educational policy. I plan to go to law school. Just a little bit of background. But I did have some thoughts that I wanted to share with everybody today, especially considering it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But I wrote them down, so I'll read them for you all now. Dr. King himself once said that we shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And as I'm sure we are all familiar with the words of John Lewis, in that we must cause the good trouble, the necessary trouble. And today is one of those days, and now in the wake of the elections, the BLM protests of the summer and the predominantly white insurrection in the Capitol is certainly one of those times. But what does it look like? Is it phone calls to our elected officials, asking them how they're keeping all those events I just stated in the forefront of their minds, as well as on the tips of their legislative pens? Yes, but it's more. Is it continuing the good work of Stacey Abrams, but the country over, lifting the power our people has in the polity? Yes, but it's more. The insurrection in the Capitol has placed us in the unique position to effect change, and what is more, to make sure our elected officials do so and are held accountable while doing it. Much like the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, the world was laughing at the United States as we waged wars for democracy and, quote, freedom abroad, but hung whites-only signs inside our own borders. Once again, the world is laughing at the United States, laughing at its ability, or inability, to separate itself from white supremacy and the influence on politics and people in this country, and its champion-elect, President Trump. And as the world laughs, the external pressure of living up to, sometimes mistaken, monikers as the greatest country, the greatest democracy, and the most free country adds the pressure that resulted in sweeping reform then and could help bring about sweeping reform now. Following the election cycle, Senator Lindsey Graham said something along these lines, quote, "We win elections because of our ideas, and we lose them because they cheat us," unquote. Now, I don't think anyone believes this to be factual, as Graham is a GOP member, but it most certainly is true for the Democratic Party. Even as Republicans in Congress and the White House have lobbed election fraud claims and bandied about the notion that this election was stolen from them, we know the truth. They did everything they could do to try and steal this election from us. Voter purges, restricting early voting, closing polling stations in Black communities, getting alt-right champions to call Black houses in the inner city and say, if you register to vote, mail-in voting, or however, the government will use such information to act upon outstanding warrants for you or for your family. So it's best if you don't vote at all, as seen in Detroit. None of this is new, as voter suppression has been a problem in this country ever since the passage of the 15th Amendment. In 2013, the Supreme Court rolled back Section 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder, determining that the enforcement measures of the act were no longer needed. And these manifested in voting rights and law changes in states and locations where the history of voter suppression had to be approved by the federal government before they could be enacted. That is no longer the case. Holding our elected officials accountable, therefore, is making sure the proposed John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act gets passed to undo the aforementioned damage of Shelby County v. Holder. Holding our elected officials accountable looks like lobbying them to get rid of felony disenfranchisement the country over, as roughly 1 in 16 African-American adults cannot vote due to felony records. Holding our elected officials accountable looks like creating standards for sentencing that do not allow for the gross misallocation of severe sentences to Black criminals, where judges can sentence Black counterparts for years for a crime in which a white perpetrator will receive a fourth of the time served, or in some instances, no jail time at all. The model for accountability, therefore, does not change, nor is it top-down. More often than not, we allow ourselves to fall into the notion that our federal government is the end-all, be-all. The United States is structured that the state governments and our local governments is where the palpable change occurs. And the federal level is how we make sure that change stays and is permanent, or in times of extreme need, how that change is kickstarted. To that end, then, I'd like to draw upon the words of race scholar Ibram X. Kendi and Irish statesman Edmund Burke. In the words of Kendi, that, quote, the heartbeat of racism is denial, that the American creed of denial, I'm not a racist, knows no political parties, no ideologies, no colors, and no regions, unquote. This country cannot deny us when we use our voices, when we gather like we are gathering today, when we use our power to impact elections time and again. And in Burke's words, that, quote, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing, unquote. And while Burke's words ring true, if a little bit overgendered, now as they did then, accountability is not only the way we affect change in the long term, it is how we measure not only the mettle of our officials, but also the energy, enthusiasm, and drive that we ourselves have to make sure the change is done, to make sure the good trouble does its work, and that the arc of the universe does not simply bend towards justice, but that it hurtles towards it like a chariot, bringing us all home.
We're talking about barriers. We're talking about strategies. We're talking about living the dream from Martin Luther King from your perspective. And the one good thing I enjoy about our discussions is that this is a multi-generational group. And so rarely do you see people that are Generation Z, as Joel. Barron actually is he is actually a millennial. As a matter of fact, he's the youngest person at age 22 that actually ran for political office. He was on the school board at the age of 22. And so Barron, being a leader, the person that he is prepared to talk and have a nice discussion today about Martin Luther King, some of the barriers that exist, but just talk about some of the opportunities or the accomplishments. Okay, Barron, take it from there.
Absolutely. So thank you, Mike, for even inviting me to speak this afternoon on this great holiday, one that is celebrated differently than I think that it should, but that's a conversation for a different day that we will have on another day. But considering the barriers as well as the strengths and maybe even the weaknesses of where we are, given the time that has progressed since we were introduced to Dr. King's dream and vision as to where we are now, it's easy to see it as a catch-22, if you will. There have been so many areas where there have been some great progressions and some great elevations to how society interacts with people of color. And then we have some really, really poor situations that highlight the points where we didn't come that far. One thing that's been on my mind heavily, and really just considering the relationship that Dr. Martin Luther King had with the FBI, you can't miss the headlines if you have been watching the news or the TVs or anything within the last 2 or 3 days. You see the insurgents of National Guard members down in DC, and I read a headline this morning that said that the FBI is currently vetting all 25,000 service members who are down in DC to protect the Capitol to make sure that they are not domestic terrorists. If you are a little bit or a tiny bit versed in the history of Dr. King and some of the interactions that he had with government, you might know that he spent the latter part of his life under investigation from the FBI for matters of, you guessed it, domestic terrorism. And if the FBI would have had the same intent 52 years ago that they have today, we may not have saw an insurgence of white supremacists at the United States Capitol 2 weeks ago. We may not have seen that if division would have been caught from that standpoint back then. That leads me to talk, and not to bolster my own experiences or anything of that nature by any means, I do notice a couple of elected folks who are on the screen. I won't call any of them out by name, but I do see a few folks that have held office. And it causes me to, when considering the government and how we are interacting on Martin Luther King Day, it causes me to think about the elected office that I held, right? As in being a member of the school board. And one thing you should know about the school board is that that is probably the only elected office that is unpaid. So you don't get any compensation for the hell that we put up with in school and local politics. But there are some other points about the school board and how that type of government body works that I think that the federal government might be able to take some pointers on. And if they were to take those pointers, maybe we would be in a position where we wouldn't have insurgencies in our government. If the federal government ran like a school board, there would be a crossfile of candidates. What does that mean? That means that you can file as both major political parties and receive votes from both sides. So both sides of folks who agree with your vision can vote for you without having to adhere to a party line. If the federal government ran like a school board, there might be a little bit more of a focus on a constituent base and not an allegiance to a party, right? So decisions would be made that come for the betterment of people and not necessarily what the betterment of a party line just might be. If the federal government were to run like a school board, there might be a little bit more pride in the office that we serve. When you are in those positions, you are the biggest cheerleader for your organization that exists. That's just how it works in school politics. If the federal government ran like a school board, there would be a realization that tradition and modernization can exist in the same space for the betterment of people, and that good change can come from recognizing the old and introducing the new all at the same time. If the federal government might run like a school board, they might understand that there aren't too many things that a beer and a slice of pizza can't fix. You might I know that I've been to Colonial Pizza more times than I care to admit in my time on the school board, getting things done and making sure things happen for the constituents that I served, which were the students and their families of the Eastern Area School District. Why do I talk about my time on the Eastern Area School Board or just my time as a school board member in general? Because it gives the explanation that when everyday people put people over politics, that is when we will see change, and that when we will see the forthcoming of the glory of the dream that was Dr. Martin Luther King's dream of equality and freedom amongst people, regardless of their race or their gender or their class position or their socioeconomic standards. Then will we achieve that dream that Dr. King fought so hard for. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.